I think he's too old, and I think his health is at a point where another term is not possible. Sometimes things don't work out well, and the great fear here is that American democracy will be undermined at its core.
Could I start just on the state of the world at the moment? Where do you fit in Donald Trump's foreign policy into your worldview of realpolitik? It doesn't really seem to have a great rationale behind it.
Yeah, it's very hard to describe exactly what President Trump's foreign policy is. I mean, as you remember, when he ran for president, he portrayed himself as the peace president. And since coming to office, he's been anything but a peace president. He declared war against Yemen. He attacked Iran. He's been a firm supporter of the Gaza genocide. And with regard to the Ukraine war, which he promised to shut down probably before he moved into the White House, but certainly right after he moved into the White House, he's failed on that front too. And he basically continues to support Ukraine. So you could make a very good case that if anything, he looks like Joe Biden number 2.
You think that supporting Ukraine is the wrong thing to do?
I think that we should go to great lengths to bring the Ukraine war to an end as soon as possible, because I think the Russians are destined to win that war, and the longer it goes on, the more territory Ukraine will lose and the more Ukrainians will die. I think there's no way that the West can help Ukraine rescue the situation. In other words, I don't think the West can help Ukraine stem the tide on the battlefield. I think Ukraine will just lose more territory, lose more men, and I think that would be disastrous for Ukraine. So my view is we ought to shut down the war now.
You did think did say that President Putin did not have territorial ambitions to take over all of Ukraine or to destroy the government there. I mean, that was wrong, wasn't it? I mean, he clearly does want to do that, and that's why many people feel that if there was a settlement now, it would simply be a pause for Russia to regroup.
No, I think, Adam, that you're wrong. And I think the problem is you have to distinguish what Putin was saying before the war started and then what happened once the war started. Anybody who has studied war like I have over a long career understands that once a war starts, you have escalation. You have escalation not only in terms of the means that are used to fight the war, but you have escalation in terms of goals. And my argument has long been that before the war, there was no evidence that Putin was interested in conquering territory in Ukraine and making it part of a greater Russia. But there's no question that once the war got going, and especially after the negotiations in Istanbul broke down in April of 2022, that Putin began to think in terms of capturing territory. And I personally believe that the longer the war goes on, the more territory he's going to want to conquer. In other words, if the West continues to push hard in favor of Ukraine and against Russia, it will incentivize the Russians to take more territory, to take places like Odessa, Kharkiv, and so forth and so on, because the Russians will understand that NATO is never going to quit fighting against Russia, and therefore it makes sense for Russia to control as much Ukrainian territory as possible.
But that is awarding an aggressor who in objective terms is considerably weaker than the NATO West.
Well, if Russia is weaker than the NATO West, why is Russia winning the war and the NATO West in deep trouble?
Well, it's not exactly winning the war, is it? But also, as you well know, the West has held back from full involvement, and that's one of the things Donald Trump has done.
Well, what do you want to do? Fight a war? Or is that your argument that what the West should do is become engaged in the fighting?
Well, there are some people who believe that if there was greater Western commitment, for example, the deployment of troops in Ukraine, that would be a deterrent, although it could lead to a war. I mean, why desert Ukraine? I mean, that's the point I'm making.
I'm not talking about deserting Ukraine. I'm talking about getting the best possible deal for the Ukrainian people. If you accept a settlement now, there's no question that Ukraine is going to lose a substantial portion of its territory, probably close to 25% of its territory.
And it would be a buffer state that couldn't join NATO, couldn't join the European Union. It would effectively be a puppet, would it not, of Russia?
I think that's basically correct. But the question is, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? To continue fighting? You, I don't think, can tell a story. You, in the generic sense of that term, you can't tell a story as to how we can help Ukraine rescue the situation. We don't have the weaponry to give the Ukrainians, and furthermore, weaponry is not their principal problem at this point in time. Their principal problem is manpower, and we certainly can't solve the manpower problem. And furthermore, President Trump is slowly but steadily divorcing himself from this conflict and shifting the burden to the Europeans. And there's no way the Europeans are going to reverse the tide. So I'm basically arguing here, Adam, that you have a choice between two bad alternatives. And I believe the least bad alternative is to settle now.
I was just really trying to put this into your theory of great powers, right? And if you think that the United States is withdrawing from Europe, doesn't appear to want to take on China. It appears to think that China can have its sphere of influence, provided the United States has its sphere of influence. From the perspective of here in the UK and in as part of the continent of Europe or off the continent of Europe, what is the future for us? Are you saying the future for us is simply Russian domination?
Well, let me make a couple points. First of all, I do believe the United States is firmly committed to containing China in East Asia. And I do believe that we want to pivot fully to East Asia. And we've been unable to pivot fully to East Asia because we're pinned down in Ukraine and we're pinned down in the Middle East. And that is not in our national interest. But I think China is a peer competitor for the United States, and we want to deal with the Chinese above all else. With regard to Europe, we have no vested interest in being in Europe. Russia is not a threat to dominate all of Europe. As you've surely noticed, they've spent the past 3 years just trying to conquer the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. The idea that this army is the second coming of the Wehrmacht and it can conquer all of Ukraine, then conquer territory in Eastern Europe and eventually be on the beaches of Dunkirk is not a serious argument. This is not that formidable an army. And furthermore, Putin would be crazy to invade Western Ukraine because he would run into huge resistance. So the idea that Western Europe, or Europe more generally, is going to be left vulnerable to Russia, this great Russian juggernaut, is not an argument I think that is correct.
I mean, it's not how the Poles or the Finns or the Secretary General of NATO see things.
I fully understand that, but they happen to be wrong.
Okay, let's talk about the Middle East. You say it's entanglement and the United States doesn't have any interest in being there. Should it therefore simply carry on as it's doing at the moment, which is permitting Israel effectively to do what it wants?
I think that the United States has a vested interest in making sure no country dominates the Middle East. And I was always in favor of having some sort of rapid deployment force that could be moved into the region if necessary. I'm not in favor of deploying large numbers of troops in the Middle East at this point in time because there's no serious threat to dominate the region. Our policies in the Middle East today are driven in large part by Israel. And in my opinion, Israel is an albatross around our neck. And we should not be supporting Israel the way we support Israel. We should treat Israel as a normal country. But that's not possible here in the United States. We support Israel unconditionally. And the end result is that we've gotten involved deeply in the genocide in Gaza. We have gotten involved in wars that Israel is waging in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Iran as well. And this is not in our national interest.
So what could be done?
The United States should treat Israel as a normal country, and we should immediately put an end to the genocide in Gaza. We have the capability to do that. If we made it clear to the Israelis that continuing the genocide was unacceptable and we'd punish them greatly if they didn't stop it, I can assure you they would stop it. And furthermore, we should go to great lengths to improve our relations with the Iranians so that the Iranians don't acquire nuclear weapons, and we should work to maintain stability in the region. And the most difficult obstacle to stability in the region at this point in time is Israel, no other country. The idea that Iran is the great destabilizer in the Middle East, I think, is not a serious argument. It's Israel that is.
I mean, Britain and France, as you know, appear to be on the brink of recognizing Palestinian statehood. Is that something that you think is wise or relevant even at this stage?
I think it's a good thing, but I'm not sure it matters very much because the United States and Israel, and you know they act as a tag team, the United States and Israel will just brush it off. They won't pay it serious attention. And of course, the United States has been going to great lengths to get the British and the French and others not to recognize a Palestinian state. But I think it is a step in the right direction. But what I'd like to see happen more than anything else is for the genocide in Gaza to stop.
What do you think?
I'm horrified.
What do you think is going to happen to Gaza? Is it going to be turned into a Riviera?
Well, I think what's going on here is that the Israelis want to ethnically cleanse Gaza. They want to drive all the Palestinians out. And I think they thought that initially they could use military force to hit the Palestinians hard enough that they could drive them out by the end of 2023, maybe early 2024. But the Palestinians have not left. No other country is willing to take the Palestinians in. And again, the Palestinians do not want to leave. And the end result is that the Israelis continue to use military force to inflict massive punishment on the Palestinians, all in the hope of driving them out. But the end result is that it's morphed into a genocide.
In that context, and what you said about the closeness of Israel with President Trump and President Trump's closeness, where do you see the symbolism of this second state visit, this so-called historic second state visit by the president to the UK this week, with lots of talk of a special relationship?
You mean the Israeli president?
No. I meant the visit by the president, President Trump. He's coming on a second state visit, and we appear to have decided that we want to put out the red carpet for him. Do you think that's a wise geopolitical strategy?
I think it's a wise strategy from Britain's point of view, but I would hope the British leadership would tell Trump that he has to change his behavior in the Middle East and, most importantly, put an end to the genocide in Gaza. But Britain has a deep-seated interest in having good relations with the United States, what many Brits would call a special relationship. And furthermore, there's no question that Britain has a deep-seated interest in keeping the United States engaged in Europe. I believe that all European states have a deep-seated interest in keeping the American pacifier in place in Europe. But as I said to you before, the problem is that the United States has a deep-seated interest in getting out of Europe and pivoting to Asia. So I think all for the purposes of keeping the American pacifier in place, the British should roll out the red carpet for Donald Trump. But again, I hope the British leadership has the good sense to put pressure on President Trump, as much pressure as possible, to change his behavior towards Gaza and towards Israeli behavior in the Middle East more generally.
I read, I don't know if it's true, that in the 2020 election, or in 2019, you thought about voting for Bernie Sanders. What do you think is happening in your country domestically at the moment? Is the erosion of institutions and the checks and balances now a determined strategy which effectively is going to turn America into an authoritarian state.
Just quickly, I voted for Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton in 2016, and then I voted for Bernie Sanders over Joe Biden in 2020. And in the 2024 election, I wrote in Bernie Sanders' name. So I've been quite consistent in the past 3 presidential elections and who I favored. Of course, it didn't work out very well, but
I mean,
just to be clear, those were my
Bernie
votes.
Sanders has been on an anti-autocracy tour. Do you think he's right? That's what's happening.
Yes, I do think he's correct. I think the United States is in deep trouble. I don't know anybody in this country, whether they're on the left or the right or in the center, who disagrees with that assessment. It's very hard to predict where this all leads at this point in time. But when you look at the state of American democracy, it's deeply worrisome. And there I'd make 2 points, Adam. The first is that I think whatever you think of President Trump's policies, I think the fact that there are no checks and balances on him, that there are no guardrails at play here, is a very worrisome situation. He basically could do anything he wants at this point in time, and he does anything he wants, and he says exactly that. In his first term in office from 2017 to 2021, there were real limits on what he could do. There were lots of guardrails, and this frustrated him greatly. And after he was defeated by Biden, he resolved that if he ever got back into the White House, that would not happen again. And that's exactly where we are at. So you have this situation where you have an autocratic leader. I mean, there are just no checks on his behavior.
But I mean, the reasons why they aren't there is because he said about destroying them or removing them. Is that fair? The checks and
Yes.
balances or the guardrails.
Yeah, but to take it a step further, the Democratic Party has self-destructed. Congress has rolled over and played dead. And here we're talking mainly about the Republicans because they control both houses of Congress. And the Supreme Court is filled with people who share his basic political philosophy. So he thumbs his nose at the courts. He can coerce the Republicans into agreeing with almost anything he wants to do. And the Democratic Party is more or less hapless in trying to resist him. So we're in a terrible situation. And again, whether this was a Democratic president or a Republican president, even if Bernie Sanders were trying to do this, I would object greatly. This is not what you want in a democracy. It's very important to have checks and balances. But the second point that I would make to you, Ad, is, did you want to say something? Well, the second thing I wanted to say to you is that the country is deeply polarized. We have a real fight between people on the left-hand side of the political spectrum and people on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. And there's remarkably little tolerance embedded in either one of those wings of the political spectrum. And there's a lot of anger, indeed a lot of hatred. And it's therefore hard to get any compromise. And there's not much of a middle left in the United States, because if you're in the middle, there are very powerful forces at play that pull you to either the left or the right. And then when you add to that terrible situation this recent assassination of Charlie Kirk and other examples of violence, one can imagine a situation where large-scale violence, something bordering on a civil war even, breaks out in the United States. I wouldn't argue that that's likely to happen, but it is certainly a real possibility.
What are the forces that you believe are pulling people apart?
Well, you have people in this country who have fundamentally different views about first principles. They have fundamentally different questions about the good life. And this means that they disagree on the role of government in our everyday life. They have fundamentally different views on subjects like abortion, on subjects like immigration. I mean, immigration is a really good example. There are lots of people on the left-hand side of the political spectrum who basically favor open borders. And people on the right reject that out of hand, and they think that open immigration of the sort that Joe Biden encouraged is going to undermine the American body politic. It's going to destroy what America's all about. Those are two fundamentally different views, and they deal with first principles. And as we all know, when first principles are at stake or questions about the good life are at stake, people are often willing to kill each other. This, of course, is why you have a state. You have a state to keep people who disagree on core issues from killing each other. So we better hope the state can.
I mean, it seems to me, looking at it from the outside, that there are things now on the agenda, the domestic agenda, to do with race, to do with sex, men and women, where things that apparently the notion of equality appeared to be settled, but now there are a lot of people really who are saying white men first. Is that fair?
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. But that's what I meant when I said that people disagree about first principles or questions of the good life. You put your finger on it. That's just another set of issues. And again, I want to emphasize that people on the far, not on the far left, people on the left and people on the right feel very strongly about these issues. And they tend to view people on the other side as the enemy. And they think that the enemy has to be dealt with in a forceful way. And that's why we're in deep trouble.
So what's going to happen? I mean, is there going to be an end to democracy, a Trump third term, a Trump perpetual term? How's this going to play out, do you think?
Well, I don't think you're going to get a perpetual Trump term in the sense that he's going to run for office again. He's not been making much noise about running for office again. I think he's too old, and I think his health is at a point where another term is not possible. But one could argue if you get J.D. Vance that there won't be much difference between him and Trump. And you can argue that if the Democrats come back to power, you'll get a firebrand on the Democratic side who will go to great lengths to stamp out all of the Republican policies left over from the Trump years, and that this will enrage people on the right and it will fuel the fires. So you can tell all sorts of stories about how this has a very unhappy ending and American democracy is undermined. On the other hand, we do want to emphasize that the roots of American democracy run deep, and that the United States has faced major crises before and overcome them. And the American Civil War is, of course, the best example of that. I also remember the 1960s very well, having been a teenager and then a young man throughout the 1960s. That there was a great deal of turmoil in the United States, and sometimes it felt, especially in the year of 1968, like the country was coming apart at the seams. So we've faced trouble before, and fortunately in all those other cases we came through it okay. But sometimes things don't work out well, and the great fear here is that American democracy will be undermined at its core.
Finally, what does it tell you about the differences between our two countries that two friends of Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump and Peter Mandelson, one, a gay man, has lost his job as ambassador, and Donald Trump continues to be president?
I'm not sure what to say. I think Donald Trump is sui generis. Donald Trump, has argued that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and it wouldn't matter. One does have the sense that there's nothing Donald Trump could do that would get him into serious trouble. And Peter Mandelson is a different case. I would imagine if Britain's prime minister had any ties with Jeffrey Epstein, that he'd be out on his ear as well. But with President Trump, it's really quite amazing what he gets away with, because his ties to Jeffrey Epstein are very close. It's really quite remarkable. And it's hurt him in the approval ratings, but not all that much. And nobody's talking about him being removed from office the way Peter Mandelson was pushed aside. So when it comes to President Trump, he is a truly amazing phenomenon. Whatever you think of the substance of his views, or whatever you think of how he governs, I don't think we in this country have ever seen anything like him. And to be honest, I hope we never see anything like him again, because I don't think it's healthy for democracy. Again, as I pointed out before, regardless of what you think of his views, right, his way of governing in a liberal democracy like the United States, in my view, is dangerous.